any country, and there's certainly any Western democratic country that's had hostages for 8 months, will try to rescue them if it's a possibility. But just to rescue these four took weeks, if not probably months, from what I'm hearing, of planning.
Mm.
Obviously, you're not going to be able to rescue the remaining 60, 70, 80 hostages, however many are actually left alive right now, through raids like this. It would take years upon years. And so I don't think it changes the calculus of the need for some sort of negotiated hostage release for prisoner swap. But I do think it certainly creates a situation where Sinwar now has an excuse again through propaganda of saying how many were killed to say, no, there's no reason for me to negotiate. Look what Israel is doing. And that can complicate things right now.
Yeah, the ratio is certainly something to consider here. You save four, but nearly 300 lives, according to Hamas, were lost in the process. So it comes back to what the Secretary of State is really going to be accomplishing on this trip, Jonathan. If you think actually the likelihood of a ceasefire agreement being reached in the near term is now less than it was, is Antony Blinken going to walk away with nothing? Again, is this getting a little bit embarrassing diplomatically for the United States?
Look, I think it's never a bad thing to try. When you're in a war and you're in a crisis, and the U.S. still remains probably the only country that may be able to have some influence on the Israeli side, though I think it's less, frankly, as we're seeing, than everybody has thought it might be in the region. I think it's always worth trying to create a ceasefire and get to a stage of peace. That said, I'm not particularly optimistic. I do think right now this is about Sinwar. Hamas, for a long time now, has been viewed as a monolithic organization, and I think that's wrong. There's many fragments of Hamas, some of the political ones in Gaza, some of the political ones in Doha. The reality is, though, the only person that matters when it comes to Hamas right now is Yahya Sinwar. And for him, there's not a lot of benefit to agreeing to a ceasefire. And if he doesn't agree to a ceasefire, well, then there's no pressure for Netanyahu to ultimately agree to one either, because Hamas has to go first at this stage. That's what the pressure from the Biden administration was about. I think Secretary Blinken is trying to emphasize that for his travels throughout the region, including in Egypt. We'll see what happens, but obviously I think we're not nearly as optimistic as a lot of folks were when the president originally gave his speech 2 weeks ago.
Well, with that said, Jonathan, the U.S. is asking the United Nations Security Council for a vote on its latest resolution here for a ceasefire in Gaza. What impact, if any, would that have?
Look, I think it could, again, increase the pressure and try to compel anybody who might have influence on Hamas to try and pressure Sinwar. But the reality is it's probably not going to have much of an impact. I think it's always good when the world speaks in a unified voice. And I think we've seen that in smaller forms. So the G7 statement supporting President Biden's initiative, the Arab Quint statement supporting the president's initiative. Obviously, additional momentum, keeping it in the headlines is always important. But in terms of actual impact, I think it's probably going to be minimal in the end.
Jonathan, we also want to make sure to ask you about the departure of Benny Gantz from the Israeli government. On the one hand, of course, it was in part protest to Prime Minister Netanyahu's handling of the war. On the other hand, what this leaves in the war cabinet is much greater influence, perhaps, of the far right, considering Gantz was a moderate. What should we make of his departure and the difference it will make going forward in Israel's conduct in this ongoing war?
It's a great question. The reality is this has been a long time coming. Both Gantz and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister who is part of the war cabinet, have been arguing for months there needs to be, from Netanyahu, a post-war plan for Gaza. Obviously, the international community and the U.S. has prioritized the Palestinian Authority playing a major role. Netanyahu said no to that. And so if the answer is no to that, what is the actual plan? And that's not clear yet. And that frustration is what led Benny Gantz to decide we can't do this anymore and take his party out and for himself to leave the war cabinet. Whether it's actually going to have...
Is it a cabinet of two then? What happens?
Yeah, so look, the war cabinet had 6 members, only 3 were voting. You've got 2 options. One is that Netanyahu can replace Benny Gantz. Obviously, ultra-nationalists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have both said they want the seat. I think that's unlikely to happen. I think Netanyahu knows that it's probably suicidal for him with the international community, given how toxic those two are. I think he could replace them with a Likud member and somebody who's been more loyal, or he could decide he's going to disband the war cabinet. But all of these have risks. So if he disbands the war cabinet, then you're in jeopardy of every major decision related to the war having to go to the full cabinet. And if it goes to the full cabinet, well, once again, the ultra-nationalists are there who are pushing not only for an opportunity to push harder against Hamas and eliminate Hamas, but have been very clear they want settlements to return of Israelis to Gaza. They want to be able to push further into the West Bank. And you're talking about something that's likely to actually increase tensions at a time where I think everybody recognizes the need for them to come down a little bit.
Especially, Jonathan, considering it's not just tensions between Israel and Hamas, but in the wider Middle East that could potentially be amplified from this, knowing prior to October 7th, there was an effort underway for Saudi normalization, an effort that obviously was disrupted by the events of that day, everything that has happened thereafter. Yet that is also something that the U.S. is pushing, and I'm sure is on the mind of Antony Blinken as he makes this latest trip to the Middle East. How should we be considering the Saudi factor?
Yeah, look, the Saudi normalization deal has been on the table for a while. I think in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there was a contention by some that now normalization's off the table. The reality is Saudi normalization with Israel is about one thing, and it's not Israel. It's about U.S. security guarantees and U.S. engagement with Saudi Arabia over the long term. Saudi Arabia is desperate to try and redefine their economy and to have a Vision 2030 actually implemented. And that means a move away from hydrocarbons. The only way Saudi Arabia is going to be able to successfully diversify their economy is to ensure their security is sacrosanct. And to do that, you either need to have really good relations with everybody in the region, something hard to imagine, even with the rapprochement with Iran, or you need some sort of umbrella protection. There's not enough political risk insurance in the world to ensure Saudi's domestic goals are met. The reality is you got Houthi rockets, Iranian rockets in the future going down on Saudi Arabia. And so for the Biden administration, this has been a key issue because they think this would transform the region if you had Saudi normalization with Israel. I think it probably would, but my guess is time is also running out right now. To get that passed through the Senate, you would need a treaty. To be able to do that as we head to an election season here in the U.S., I just think it's becoming less and less likely. They're going to keep trying, but I think it's harder to envision it coming to fruition in the next 6 months, 7 months before the new administration takes over.
Hey, Jonathan, we only have 1 minute. I have to ask you about this Axios report talking about a warning from the Biden administration to Israel about opening a new front, about waging war, committing to a war against Hezbollah. Is this something that's about to happen, knowing that Israel has not listened to a lot of advice from the U.S. recently?
I'm increasingly concerned that it is. 6 months ago, I really didn't think it would happen. Israel didn't want it. Hezbollah almost certainly doesn't want it. Iran doesn't want it. But the rocket attacks that have been coming from Hezbollah, the drone attacks, Hezbollah said today they intercepted an Israeli drone on the other side. I think we're increasingly likely to see some sort of conflict. If it sparks because it's Israeli instigated, I think that's going to be a real challenge for the Biden administration, who said that they're not going to support Israel in such a war. If it's from Hezbollah, that's a different story. But the most likely scenario is that something sparks because of an unintended escalation, a back and forth with the rockets that gets out of hand. Look, it's not guaranteed. Amos Hochstein is working very, very hard to get the Hezbollah, Radwan special forces away from the Israel-Lebanon border. But I think the chances of war are dramatically increasing right now.